Hi, welcome to my workshop. This is part one of Paper Piecing Art, Beginner and Beyond. My name is Jennifer Ofenstein and I'm a paper piece pattern designer and instructor. I run the website sewhook.com and I also run a website called fandomandstitches.com. In part one, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction so that you have an idea of what you need and where we're going to go with this workshop. First of all, I'm going to show you what we're making. We will be making this pattern. This is a tree that I designed specifically for this workshop. It's very simple and has very basic shapes and some interesting angles so that I can show you some tips and techniques for dealing with different shapes in a paper piece pattern. The fun thing about this is, as in all things, when you follow a pattern, if the materials that you choose are going to dictate what your final piece looks like. So this is a very calm, sedate tree. This is made all out of batiks. I have another tree that's made using more interesting textured fabrics. I use a tree fabric here and a leaf fabric here, and then we have a very very sunsetty sky. And I have a third one to show you. This one is made completely out of scraps. The trunk's all different browns. The canopy is made out of all different kinds of leaf fabrics, and then the background is consistent, but then I have wildflowers down here. So it really depends on your fabric choices as to what you want your tree to look like. What you need to know today are the items that you need for this workshop. So I'm going to give you this list, but this is also available in your workshop PDF. You can download this, print it out, and it's got everything that you need for this workshop. It's all on a very easy to check off list. The first thing you're going to need today is the pattern for your workshop. You're going to print that out and it's going to look like this. Paper Piecing Art. And this pattern includes the list of everything I'm about to show you. It includes a pattern key that will show you the different textures that are used in the pattern, what those fabrics are for, and I will explain that as we begin stitching. And it includes your paper piece pattern. This pattern is what makes this tree. After you have your pattern ready to go, you're going to want a sewing machine that's in good working order. Make sure it's oiled and cleaned and you have a brand new sewing machine needle in there. I like Universal 8012. The number will be right here. And if you get a multiple pack of universal needles, your 8012 is going to be somewhere in the middle. You can also use a 70, that works fine too. Any size you like is fine. I just like a slightly bigger needle for paper piecing. You're going to want either an open toe foot or you're going to want a clear foot. This is similar in shape to the open toe foot, but it has little clear pieces here. And the reason for this is you need to be able to see through this piece. I prefer a clear foot because I like a little more control with my foot, but whatever you want to use is fine, open toe or clear, as long as you can see the line you're stitching on. Probably most important next to your sewing machine and your pattern is going to be your fabric. So I've decided to go with swirls. You're going to need blue, green, brown, and something to represent grass. You don't have to use the colors I use. This is sky, this is canopy, this is trunk, and this is foreground. So whatever color combinations you want to choose for that is great. You only need 4 colors, you need small amounts. You can use fat quarters or fat eighths, or you can use scraps of fabric that you have. I prefer to always use 100% quilting cotton when I'm sewing. If you are consistent with the kinds of fabric that you're using when you paper piece, you're going to have a more consistent outcome. You're going to want a natural color piecing thread. So a gray works great, or an ecru works great. And the reason you want a neutral is this is going to blend into all the different colors of fabrics that you'll be piecing together. Also make sure that you have a full bobbin to match your thread. You're going to need 2 pairs of scissors, a pair for cutting your paper, and I like a small pair of scissors to use for trimming thread. You can use the thread cutter on your sewing machine, but I will show you as we're going along why this little pair of scissors comes in very, very handy. You're going to need quilting pins. Not many of them, just a few, maybe 2 or 3, but you will need them and they'll be very useful while you're paper piecing. I like flower head pins, and these are a long flathead pin. You can see I have them here on my magnet. This is a long pin, and they also come with butterflies and other shapes like this, but it's very long and it will lie really flat. You're going to want a seam ripper just in case. You're going to need a rotary cutter with a blade. Make sure your blade is sharp, and you're going to want a rotary mat. This is just a tiny rotary mat, and I'm only showing you this as an example. These come in all sizes. My preferred size is a 24 by 36, and I actually have two of them. So I have one right next to my sewing machine, and then I have one on my cutting table, and they're very, very useful to have for when you're trimming your blocks and when you're squaring up. But if all you have is a little mat like this will work too. The one specialty tool I'm going to recommend for you today is called an add a quarter ruler. And these rulers come in 6 to 12 inches, and you can get add a quarter, add an eighth. I think it even comes in add a 16th. But for our needs, add a quarter works perfectly. It is an optional tool, but it is also a very useful tool. You're going to need a postcard or another straight edge like a bookmark or a playing card, just anything that's inflexible that you can fold a piece of paper over. And last but definitely not least, you're going to need an iron and an ironing board. Pressing is very important when you're paper piecing, and when you're doing most quilting, it's going to be important. If you have a personal ironing station, that works great, or just a regular iron and an ironing board, that works great too. Now that you know what you need and you can get it all together, I will see you in part 2. Step 1 is probably the simplest. The very first thing we're going to do is use our paper scissors to cut our pattern out from the excess margin. You're going to want to cut on the outside of this line. This is the seam allowance, and it's important that remains intact. Now that we have our pattern cut into pieces, we're going to prepare our sewing area for stitching. Once you have a new needle on your machine, your open toe or clear foot in place, and your neutral thread has been threaded through that new needle, the next thing you need to do is shorten your stitch length. We're going to shorten our stitch length from the standard sewing machine stitch, which depending on your machine it's going to be like a 2 or a 2.5, and we're going to shorten it down to a 1.2. A short stitch length will do a couple of things. One, it will keep your stitches intact when you start pulling the paper off of your fabric. And two, it will help keep all those stitches from showing from the front side. By now you should have your pattern trimmed out and your fabric selected. You're going to need your rotary cutter, your postcard, and your add a quarter ruler. Let's start with piece E. Find the line between piece 1 and piece 2 on unit E. It's going to be this line right here, and it's going to be a piece of sky fabric and a piece of grass fabric. We're going to use our postcard and we're going to fold right along that line. Next I'm going to take my sky fabric, place my pattern on here, and I'm going to want to make sure I get a piece of fabric that's the right size for this. It needs to be a little bit bigger all the way around just to make sure that we have enough. I'm going to place my add a quarter ruler right there using my rotary cutter. We're going to trim that away. Now take one of your flathead pins and pin that first piece of fabric in place. I like a flathead pin because it lays flat and it doesn't buckle the paper while you're stitching. So flip this over. Next we're going to take the piece of fabric that we've chosen for our grass. And we want a piece that's just long enough. So I'm just going to chop a piece of that off. So when you look at this piece, you're going to see that this line only goes from here to here, even though piece 1 extends beyond this line. So all we're focusing on is this little piece of fabric right here. So we know that it goes on this end. So we're going to place this piece of fabric on this end. I'm going to take this pin that I used previously and I'm going to pin this on. Just to recap, we've got piece 1 is right side up, piece 2 is right side down. When you fold this down, you're going to see that you have 1/4 inch. That's from using the add 1/4 ruler. So now what we're going to do is we're going to sew from this line to this line. And when you do this, I want you to take 1 or 2 stitches before and 1 or 2 stitches after. So we stitched right on that line. So now you're going to take your little scissors and just snip that thread right to the paper. Flip this over on the other side and do exactly the same thing. Just snip the thread right off. We're going to take this to our ironing board and press. Now this is where it starts getting really fun and really interesting. Take your postcard. You're going to find the next line. In a lot of ways, paper piecing is like dot to dot. So we're going 1 to 2, 2 to 3, etc. So what we're going to do is we're going to find the next line, which is 2 to 3. And we're going to place this card on that line. We're going to fold this. And you can see that there's fabric sticking out here. If you didn't fold this piece of paper, it'd be really hard to see where to trim this. But what we're going to do is, since we folded this with our postcard, we're going to use our add 1/4 ruler. We're going to place it down. We're going to use our rotary cutter. And we're going to trim that right off. So now we have this angle, which you can see echoes the angle on this side. Now 3 is going to be a piece of tree, so we want to get our tree fabric now. I'm going to show you a really easy way to figure out how much fabric you need here. So this is just a regular 6-inch square ruler, and this piece of fabric, if you put your ruler on it, you're going to want to just give yourself like 1/2 inch all the way around. So 1/2 inch all the way around is going to be about 2 inches wide, and it's going to be about 4 inches long. So we're just going to cut a piece of fabric that's at least 2 by 4. This fabric is a little over 4 inches long, so I'm just going to cut about a 2 1/4 inch piece. And then when we place this, if you place your fabric on here, go ahead and put it in place, then turn it over to the other side. Instead of stitching, the first thing I want you to do is put a pin, use your flathead pin, and just pin it along the stitching line. We're going to audition this piece of fabric. Even though we cut it to the right size, we just want to make sure that we're going to get this flip. We want this angle when we open it up. So flip it over and then open it back up. You can feel it with your fingers, or you can hold it up to the light, and you can see that this is going to cover when we stitch this. So go ahead and take this pin out and leave this piece of fabric exactly where you had it, and then take it back to your sewing machine. trim. And then when you open that up, it's going to cover perfectly because you auditioned it first. Unit 4 is also a piece of tree, so we're going to go from 3 to 4. We're going to repeat what we just did on the last piece. Take your postcard, find your line, if you have a couple of stitches that are tight there, just pull them out of the paper. It won't hurt a thing. Add a quarter ruler. Flip that open. You've got your 1/4 inch seam, so now all we have to do is place that next piece of fabric right on top. So remember, just as a refresher, when we started with piece 1, that piece went right side up. All subsequent pieces will go right side down, so right sides will be facing. So now we're going to need another piece of tree. This one will be a little bit easier to figure out because it's just a straight across piece. So what we're going to do is we're just going to lay this down right like this. I can see exactly how much I need. I'm going to take my rotary cutter and cut straight across. We're going to take this piece, place it right down like this, and then we're going to take it back to our sewing machine. We have one more small piece on Unit E, and that's the number 5. Number 5 is also going to be sky. So we're going to trim this down just like we've done previously. So get your postcard and your add a quarter. I'm going to trim this right down. And all we need here is a small piece of sky. I have this little scrap piece, so I'm not even going to bother trimming it yet. I'm just going to place this on here. And I know from feeling of both sides that it's going to cover. Now we're going to take this back to our machine. Trim your threads. Since I used this bigger piece of fabric, I'm just going to take my rotary cutter and slice that off right there. This is what the finished E looks like before we've trimmed it up. It doesn't look like much yet, but this will be the base of your tree when all the pieces go together. Now, you might be wondering, should you trim this? Should you do anything with it? At this point, don't do anything else with this. We're going to set this aside and we're going to move on to the next piece. Now that you've got the basics down, we're going to go ahead and move on to Unit D. This is the simplest piece in the entire pattern. It only has 3 pieces of fabric. And we're going to piece this just like we did Unit E. We're going to start with a piece of background fabric. Then we're going to move to our tree fabric and another piece of background fabric. And we're going to move on to Unit B, which is a little bit more complicated. Paper piecing, no matter how complex the pattern, is always the same technique. It's always start with piece 1, move to piece 2. You fold, you trim, you stitch. Try to break it down into units. So like this is 1 unit, so I'm treating this like a single pattern. And when I'm done with this, I set it aside and I don't worry about it until I get back to the overall pattern. So this piece is going to have canopy, it's going to have background, and it's going to have tree. Piece 1 is going to be canopy, so we're going to get some of our canopy fabric. I don't need a huge piece of this, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of eyeball this and have a look and see how much of this do I need. And that should be plenty, so I'm just going to cut that off. You can see the lines of the pattern, even I think here in the video, you can see the lines through the pattern on the back. So I'm going to cover that up and make sure it's nice and covered. And then I'll go ahead and pin that. Then we're going to use our add a quarter and our postcard to trim on our stitching line. A piece like this can be a real nightmare for beginners, but it's actually very simple to figure out how to do this, and I'm going to show you exactly what you have to do. So this piece, because of the way you would normally sew, you would put 2 pieces together like this, and then you would fold it out. That would not cover this piece, this little 2. As we want a piece of fabric that's going to stitch across here, but it also needs to cover down here. We're going to audition our fabric just like we did earlier, and I'm going to pin this piece in place just to see if it's going to work. Then I'm going to flip this, I'm going to open it up, turn it over, and you can see very clearly that that's going to cover piece 2. So now I'm going to go ahead and take this pin out, and then I'm going to stitch. Remember to always take 1 or 2 stitches before, stitch on your line, and then take 1 or 2 stitches after. So we have 1 and 2 on. Let's move on to piece 3. We're going to take our postcard, fold, trim, a nice clean line there. And now this piece, number 3, is going to be tree. So let's find our tree fabric. I'm going to stop here to explain to you how to get this angle. This is an odd shaped piece for a 5. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my piece of canopy. It's wide enough to cover this entire piece. I'm going to lay my fabric down on there with this wrong side up so that it will be facing the correct way when I open it. I'm going to open this up and you can see what that angle is going to look like. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use my out of quarter ruler and I'm going to trim that just like that. So I'm going to take that piece away, and then this piece is the piece that will go here. And you can see that that angle looks very strange when you put it on here like this. But what will happen is when you flip it open, it will cover what you need it to cover. Now we have all of our units together. Each piece has all the fabric that it needs to have in order to make the tree block. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with piece B and C, and on my patterns you'll find what's called a piecing order. And the piecing order for this block would be B to C, A to B to C, A, B, C to D to E. It's very simple. And B to C very clearly goes together here. So we're going to trim this piece, and if you have a second rotary cutter, which not everyone does, and if you don't, that's okay, but I happen to have two, so I put my older blades in this rotary cutter, and this is what I use to trim anything that has paper on it with. So I'm going to take a regular ruler and use my line right here, line this up really nice, and we're going to trim that excess right off. I'm going to leave all of this on until we get to the next step. So now we're going to take Unit C and trim the stitching line where it's going to connect to Unit B. Now you can see how nice and neat those two are going to stitch together. Take one of your flathead pins and find the corner of C right here. And now we're going to take B, we're going to find the same corner, and what that'll do is that'll ensure when you stitch this, this will be perfectly aligned. Go ahead and take that out. Now I stitched right along the stitching line, just like I did on every other piece. This also happens to be 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And almost all quilt blocks use a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance unless they say otherwise. So 1/4 of an inch seam allowance here. Now that this is stitched in place, I'm going to go ahead and pull off just this one piece. So I pulled off just the seam allowance. I'm going to open this up and then I'm just going to press that to the side. I like to press from this side so that if I've used any Scotch tape or crayon or anything on here, that won't get on my iron. Now that we have B and C together, we're going to trim all of these inside lines. We're going to leave all the outside lines alone. We're going to trim here, here, and here. And we're going to take these over to the sewing machine and sew these pieces together. These two will go together exactly like B and C went together. Find your corner. And you're going to find that corner right there. You're going to find the corner on this side. And we'll use that to line this up so that we know that it's perfectly aligned. Now we're going to stitch this. Now we're going to press that and see how it looks. When you see it like this, it looks like a bit of a mess, but the reason I asked you to leave all these pieces on is because your patterns don't always line up the way you intend for them to, and if you have a little extra on the side, you can make adjustments based on the pattern and the size that you want the pattern to be. When this is trimmed up, it'll make an 8 by 10 finished piece. This is a 12.5 inch ruler. If you don't have a 12.5 inch ruler, you can use a smaller ruler and use the grid on your cutting mat to help you measure this. I'm going to go ahead and use my ruler because it's by far the easiest way to do this. So we're going to find the bottom seam allowance right here. I'm going to line up with the seam allowance, making sure that it's a 1/4 inch all the way across. I'm going to trim that off. Now I'm going to line up here with the bottom seam allowance because that's already straight. And then I'm going to align here. It's not perfectly straight going up and down the sides, but when I trim it, it will be. I'm going to hold my ruler and make sure I don't get my fingers near the edge. And now we're going to line this up here. This should be 10.5 from here and 8.5 this way. Trimmed up like this, this is 8.5 by 10.5. If you would like to put this in a picture frame, trim it down to 8 by 10. And that will cut off your seam allowance, but it'll make this frameable. So you're going to flip this over, and now you have your tree. It's completely done. You can put this in a quilt, you can embellish it, you can, like I said before, you can trim off your seam allowance and you can frame it. You can bead this, quilt it, embroider it, whatever you want to do, whatever seems like the best thing to do, and whatever would make you happy. Well, that's the end of my workshop. I hope you enjoyed yourself. If you have any questions whatsoever, please do let me know, and I'll do my best to help you out with whatever you need help with. You can find me not only on Stitched, but you can find me on my own website on sewhook.com and on fandomandstitches.com. It's another website that I run. And you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Ravelry, all kinds of great places. There will be links in my bio. You guys make sure and try this pattern out. It's a lot of fun. It's super easy. It's a great way to learn. And when you're done, you have a little piece of art that you can frame, quilt, embellish, embroider, or display in any way that you choose. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to hear from you soon. Bye.